What's going on, everybody? On today's Fantasy Life show, we are breaking down some rookies who might be overvalued or undervalued based on their talent profile relative to their draft capital. And of course, the man who is joining us to make all that happen, Fantasy Life Director of Analytics, all-around baller, Dwain "The Rock" McFarland. Dwain, happy Monday.
Happy Monday, Ian. I just realized the guitar is still sitting behind me in the shot, just was doing some jamming on Friday night. So yeah, feeling really good. Excited to talk about these players. We have a lot of people really moving right now in mock drafts. Some big risers, big fallers, some of those things definitely bake into the players we're going to talk about today.
Talk about a great day to be great, my friend. If you guys have been listening to us over the course of these last few weeks, first of all, we thank you. But second of all, you might have actually found the seed that kind of launched this podcast episode when we were talking through wide receivers. I asked Dwain, what about someone by the name of Kyle Williams? Didn't have a lot of draft capital, which again is basically the biggest input in terms of the supermodel weighting that goes into it. But obviously, Dwain has a bunch of other stuff that calculates kind of talent profile. And Mr. Williams was, one of these players who actually had a much higher ranking if you remove the draft capital. So, Dwain, that really is what we're trying to get to today. Looking at players that kind of independent of that ever important draft capital weighting might be a bit higher or lower in the model.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Like, this is the day where we get to talk about what the model thinks about the players without draft capital. Now, NFL draft capital is the number one input in the supermodel, but we do have this non-draft capital version of the model just to basically call out some of these players where maybe the NFL is a little bit too high. Maybe the NFL is a little bit too low. We'll talk about each of the positions and how predictive the non-draft capital model has been versus the supermodel with draft capital. It's been really good for running backs and for tight ends. Not quite as good for wide receivers. So we'll work through some of those things as we get there, Ian. But yeah, excited to dive into these players.
And just for the record, yes, draft capital does help give it the extra push over the top. But Dwain, your running back supermodel specifically has a positive 0.7 correlation just without draft capital. Now, you add in the draft capital, you get a 0.75. So yes, it is better. But again, not trying to be complete slaves to draft capital here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the great thing about the running back supermodel as an example is that 0.70 is equal to NFL draft capital, right? The league is investing billions and billions of dollars in trying to figure out which players are good. And then they're already invested in them, right? So you have general managers that want to see their top picks succeed so they continue to get more chances. And that's why it is the number one input, in the rookie supermodel. But it is really cool to see, especially with running back and with tight end, which we'll talk about in just a bit, how strong the model actually is without draft capital. So for me, just the nerd in me, that's the thing that I find the most cool about this. At the end of the day, we're going to go ahead and include it because we want, you guys to succeed at fantasy football. And the more we have, and by having draft capital in there, it does improve the model. So it is fun, though, to think about, okay, wow, how does some nerd with a spreadsheet even get anywhere close to NFL draft capital?
And with that, guys, let's get into that nerd and his spreadsheet and go through, again, some of the players who just really do have these large differences between their overall supermodel score. And then if we go ahead and remove the draft capital element from it. So kicking things off, Dwain, with a guy who is a lot of people's fairly clear-cut RB2 in this class, and that is North Carolina running back Omarion Hampton. Comes in now with draft capital as the 13th best score, I believe, dating back to 2018. Without draft capital, however, he falls to 22nd. So -9 difference. And I do think that kind of reflects the reality of what we were going through earlier in our running back episode where, yes, Hampton, you can make a good argument he's the RB2, but difference between RB2 and RB5, maybe not as big as people think.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you can also think of it, the difference between RB1 and RB2 is actually really big, which is between himself and Genty. And so I think, I try to listen to a lot of other draft shows, especially listen to people that watch a lot of the film. There are some people out there that look at Omarion Hampton and say that, he's probably in the same tier as, Ashton Genty, and that's a tier together. I just don't see it, right? The data doesn't show that. I think the other thing that this shows is we can't go back and say that this is a class that's on par with 2017, where we had CMC, we had Leonard Fournette, We had Alvin Kamara. I can go on and on. We also had Aaron Jones in that draft class. So, and I'm missing some of the top round picks that went in that class. So it's not quite on that level, but it is one of the top three running back classes that we've seen since 2017. But what I would say with Hampton is, to your point, he really does fit more in a tier, below Ashton Genty. And we don't have anyone sitting in that tier right below Genty and then this tier. Now, again, with the draft capital in the model, like 80% of the time, his comps have gone on to be a running back one, which we really do care about. But whenever you remove that draft capital, Ian, it does expand the range of outcomes. And if you look historically at some of the guys that have graded in a similar nature, so looking at players that were going at the end of round one, right now it looks like Omarion Hampton, if you look at mock draft data, NFL mock draft database, pick 25. Some people are saying it's going to be 20 to the Broncos. That's the popular thing. But basically, I went back and looked at, okay, running backs that are going towards the end of round one that actually had a grade of -9 or higher, in the non-draft capital supermodel, right? Versus their supermodel itself. And here are some of the guys that landed in that same range. Rashad Penny, I don't think we really hold that against him. I think Penny actually might have been good, right? He was just hurt. But then you start getting into some of these other names like Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So it's to me, he's a player that should be going at the beginning of round two based on what the model is saying, not a guy that should really be going in round one. Again, having said all that, if the Broncos take him in round one, we're going to assume that they're going to want to go ahead and use him, and that's going to help him in the model, and rightfully so. The model's just saying, like, this guy's probably more of a high-end round two pick, not a guy the NFL team should be thinking about in round one.
That Broncos landing spot is indeed where Thor has Hampton going in his latest mock draft. And yeah, it really is, probably the single best landing spot. PFF's ranking second ranked offensive line. Obviously, seen Sean Payton make far more with less at the running back position over the years. And yeah, why not take the two-time first team All-American at that spot if you wish? However, Dwayne, we have heard some murmurs about him going even higher, potentially the Cowboys at 12. I did something stupid a couple weeks ago. Dwayne, I heard about this. I thought it was ridiculous, and I just made a self-bet. I have nothing to gain here, but if Hampton does go to the Cowboys at 12, I will run a marathon in the name of rabies awareness. Shout out Michael Scott. So, again, not sure, how many Kona big waves I needed to have in order to make that bet against myself, but it's on the record, and we will go through it if Hampton does indeed go pick 12. Not expecting that to do so. As you mentioned, he now is at 25 in terms of the mock draft database. And good time to actually bring up those rookie supermodels because they are all fully updated, Dwayne, and man, are they beautiful.
Yeah, so we went back and we've now updated for the latest expected draft capital, so you can see all these movers that we're talking about here today. I think you're safe in your bet, but I do think the rise of Ashton Genty, probably to the Raiders, opens the door that if the Cowboys are desperate, or even a team like the 49ers, some of these teams that fall in love with running backs, I don't think you're completely safe. I would put you at I think you're 70% safe. There's a 30% chance you're running a marathon in the name of rabies awareness.
Gambling man, Dwayne. We will see what happens. For my leg's sake, I hope that he goes just a little bit later, but maybe not for, your rookie draft or supermodel sake. So good stuff on Hampton. Again, he is a guy with a lower talent score relative to that draft capital. Let's get into a couple guys who actually have a higher talent score, and we're going to kick things off with Kendall Valenzuela's favorite player in the entire draft. It is Arizona State's own RB, Cam Skattebo. Really arguably had the most impressive single game performance of last season, regardless of position, and that playoff performance against the Texas Longhorns. But Dwayne, again, in your model's history, 29th best all-time score without draft capital. However, he falls down to 39th once you go ahead and include that. So really does seem to be a wide-ranging, just area of opinions on Skattebo as a whole. Where are you falling right now?
Yeah, and just kind of listening to what the scouts and the personnel analysis folks are saying, they talk about Skattebo kind of in a similar way to what the supermodel shows us, kind of a jack of all trades, maybe not elite in any one of those areas, but really strong in the pass catching game. And the supermodel, whether you're including draft capital or not, Ian, one of the things it has a type. It loves backs that catch passes, right? Because we know that's what unlocks that fantasy goodness at the next level, especially playing a PPR, half PPR format. So it's kind of interesting because whenever you hear the draft analysts talk about it, it's almost, I don't want to say feels like a negative, but it's just like, well, he checks all these boxes, so you can kind of plug him into any role. The way the supermodel looks at him as, you could plug him into all of those roles, especially like if he gets lucky, lands on the right depth chart, a player in front of him gets hurt, and we know how things like that can suddenly snowball in. And then you're looking at, wow, I have a guy that can catch passes and also carry the ball 15, 18 times in a game. That's going to be a running back one in a lot of scenarios. So yeah, you talked about that difference of plus 10. So going back to 2017, here are the running backs in the model that grade out very similar to Skattebo. And I went ahead and cut this down to guys that basically went in that round 3-4 range. So Rachaad White was a plus 14 in the non-draft capital model. I get it. Rachaad White's going to be replaced by Bucky Irving. But you got a couple years out of Rachaad White. Why? Because of his pass catching prowess. Never was really great, as a runner, but he was getting those catches, and that was helping you in fantasy. Alvin Kamara, Ian, was a plus 10, went in this same range. Antonio Gibson, I threw him in. He didn't technically meet the plus 10, but you're on this show with me. He was a plus 9, so I had to do it. Devon Achane, plus 12, and then the final guy here is Skattebo, who is at a plus 10. So not that we think he's as explosive as an Achane or even a Kamara, but again, he's very good in the passing game, and that gives you the upside to really unlock all this goodness in fantasy. So I think that speaks really well for him, and that's why the supermodel without draft capital likes him quite a bit better than what we're getting with the supermodel, which pulls him down once we add in that expected draft capital based on mock drafts.
Really, really fun watch. If you guys are unfamiliar with him, truly runs like every single defender has just, stolen his lunch money. And the production speaks for itself, man. First FBS player since Christian freaking McCaffrey with 1,500 plus rushing yards and 500 or more receiving yards in the same season. So awfully good there. Also got to give a shout out to my friend Jetpack Galileo. Great follow on Twitter. He had to note that if Kyron Williams and Bucky Irving can be small and slow and good, then why can't Cam Skattebo be big and slow and also good? So again, not necessarily comping them to either of those guys coming out, but it does come just down to the simple fact, Dwain, where I think you have a player like Skattebo who, let's face it, didn't have a single FBS offer coming out of high school, only made his way to Arizona State over these past 2 seasons. When you kind of have these big one-year wonders, I think it kind of catches the draft community by surprise to an extent. But, maybe the guy that had over 2,300 total yards and 24 touchdowns in 13 games is actually really good at football.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. When we look at the production rating in the supermodel, that's for the player's career, right? I mean, it's essentially if you don't get on the field until your junior and senior seasons, it's really going to hurt you. You need to at least be getting some playing time early in your career. Clearly, Skattebo did that. He came in with an 86 production rating in the supermodel. That is very good. Typically, players like that, Ian, we do find some utility from them at the next level. It's not a 100% kind of thing, but also it usually comes back to they're good in the passing game, as well as they've shown they can do it on the ground. You really got to do both of those things, which is what Skattebo did. If you look at him, he had a 75th percentile best RIPTUS, or receiving yards per team pass attempt. And then if we look at his total yards per team attempt, right, which takes his rushing yards and then it takes his receiving yards times 2, he was in the 78th percentile for that. So he really scored highly in both of those categories, and that's what's really pushing him higher. His film rating, though, also was good. It's an 85 overall, and remember, for running backs, we're using PFF career grades for rushing and receiving, plus what we have from Lance Zierlein on NFL.com. That came in at an 85. So again, draft capital is the only thing holding him down. He's got a good film rating. He's got a good production rating. Now, if you look at his speed score, it's 75. So it's not like that's really helping him a lot, but the speed score doesn't matter as much as those other categories in the supermodel. It definitely matters for running backs, but it's not quite as big of a deal. So yeah, Skattebo is clearly benefiting from that production and the fact that he scored really well from a film perspective.
Have our rookie supermodel up on the screen right now. Shout out to our YouTube faithful. But yeah, Dwain, again, speed score might not be great for Skattebo. You know who it is fantastic for, though, is Bech Tuten, everyone's favorite, again, athletic demon out of Virginia Tech. So looking at Bech, man, he is just the 49th actual, running back in your model overall over the course of the entire history of it in terms of his score with draft capital. However, you take it away, man, all of a sudden he becomes the 27th best running back, plus 22 difference, Dwain. I know you just kind of mentioned the guys that are alongside Skattebo and having a plus 10 or so difference. 22, man, that seems awfully significant.
Yeah, and so I did go ahead and look a little bit further down the draft because very clearly right now, Skattebo expected to be a round 3 kind of pick. I don't think he's going to make it into round 2. Maybe he does. But Tuten so far is not sniffing that. Now, it only takes one team to decide that they really like him, and he has a lot of traits that I think NFL teams will like. But here are the closest comps for him, and it was Kenneth Gainwell. Again, the model has a type, guys. What was Kenneth Gainwell really good at in college? He was good as a receiver. Bech Tuten does also have that going for him, not quite to the level as Kenneth Gainwell. But here's another really interesting one. Ramondre Stevenson. A guy that NFL draft capital didn't like as much, but the supermodel really did. And he's a guy that's been productive for you in fantasy football. The other one was Jeremy McNichols. So that's another miss on them all. Yeah, hanging around in the NFL, but not necessarily a guy that we love for fantasy purposes. And then you have Tuten sitting there at that plus 22. So he is a guy, though, man, like he's got the explosiveness, Ian. Like if you just look at his complete profile across the board, it's not like you see anything that's just super nuts besides what we have for his his speed score, which is a 93 rating overall. Remember, guys, everything for the supermodels on a scale between 50 and 100. So a 93 is actually really, really good. He came with a 118.3 speed score, which is 85th percentile going back to 2017. But look at his film rating. It was also decent. It was at a 79. So you want to try to stay around an 80. And then his production rating was also an 80. So he's just a guy that checks all the boxes really strong, though, in that explosive area. If you listen to some of the folks talk about him and his film, and me just broadening out beyond what Lance Zierlein says, people do talk about fit potentially being an issue for the guy. That he probably doesn't want to land in a zone scheme because he's not necessarily the best at reading those things. But if you put him somewhere where it's going to be more of a power blocking scheme or an angle blocking scheme, and he knows exactly where he needs to go, that's the kind of situation that really could unlock him. So kind of thinking to a guy like Jalen Wright, a guy that we talked about last year. And if you go back and look at how Miami tried to use him last year, it was very obvious things, right? They're running these power tosses and different things like that. So we'll have to keep an eye on landing spot. But yeah, the model 22 spots ahead without draft capital versus with.
Now, we have Thor Nystrom's 2-round mock draft go live on fantasylife.com last week. And he actually did have Skattebo leaking in at the very end, 61st. The Washington Commanders does not have Tuten actually making it inside of the top 64 picks. So things could change. Not saying Thor's going to get every single one right. Make sure you check that out, though, if you have not already. Last thing on Tuten, though, is just, again, I will say ball security, job security, a little bit of a problem. Did have 10 fumbles and 406 career touches. But yeah, cannot overemphasize just how much of a freak he is, and accordingly was on Bruce Feldman's freak list. In addition to all this speed and jumping ability, Dwain, my man's can bench 400 pounds out there. Absolute dog out there on the field. So
Jesus.
Mention the differences, and I know it's crazy, man. But mention the difference in kind of overall prospect rank, and plus 22, is significant. But if you look at it just relative to this year, man, I mean, with draft capital RB8, but all the way up into your top 5 if we're actually just looking again, independent of the potential draft capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if he does surprise, right, if Tuten surprises and goes higher, like he could actually be the guy with the most to gain, in the model. So we'll have to keep an eye on what happens there. But yeah, he would be the running back 5 instead of the running back 8 if we were just looking at the non-draft capital model, which you mentioned earlier, a 0.70 correlation to success in the first 3 years for running backs versus 0.75 once we add draft capital in there. So there's definitely, a pretty strong signal there. Relative, right, to the way that we normally look at these things for future NFL prospects.
Now talking about your actual RB5 for the time being, when including draft capital, and that is Iowa's own Caleb Johnson. However, this is a situation kind of in the more similar mold as Omarion Hampton, where we are looking at someone who does drop quite a bit when we are not giving him the benefit of the doubt with that draft capital. So just 60th all-time best score, again, without draft capital, up to 37th with it. So again, is a big deal. And I will say, Dwain, if you're just trying to figure out, the best landing spot for Caleb, how could he run the hottest in this draft? Well, yeah, probably Thor's mock draft that has him going 50th overall at the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, so look, if Caleb goes early, he goes to a team that needs a running back. Obviously, we know we're going to be drafting him in fantasy, but this is a pretty scary list. So I isolated this down to guys that have had a very similar non-draft capital grade to Caleb Johnson, basically within 10 of his rating in the model. And then I looked at guys that were 20 spots below what supermodel had said about them, and they had to be late round 1, round 2 type guys. That's basically where he's expected to go. Sony Michel was a -20, Caleb Johnson -23, Kenneth Walker III, this one worked out right, -27. He ended up being fine. Ronald Jones -52, Miles Sanders -66. Now, obviously, those last 2 guys are quite a bit below where Caleb is at -23. But looking at that list, man, those are all guys that we really didn't enjoy having on our fantasy rosters. Miles Sanders gave you a little bit. Ronald Jones gave you a little bit. But overall, we would consider those to be busts at this point. So Caleb Johnson is the guy that's going in that early round 2 right now in mock drafts that the non-draft capital supermodel likes the absolute least and thinks that he's a reach. Sees him more as a round 3 type prospect.
Also, certainly someone who has kind of gotten varying comps throughout the community. I've seen a lot of Arian Fosters thrown around because we love to compare every freaking upright runner to Arian Foster. But maybe, we do see him settle in more so as the DeMarco Murray type of things. That was where Dane Brugler was going with in his ever fantastic The Beast, which published last week. Make sure you guys check that out over at The Athletic. So, hey, 1,500 plus rushing yards, 23 total touchdowns in 12 games at Iowa last year. Again, we're not completely doubting the man by any stretch, but unlike some of these other guys, Dwayne, I do think, you mentioned the Kenneth Walker comp. Not saying Caleb Johnson can't catch the football. We just haven't seen a lot of it already.
Yeah, and I think Caleb Johnson's probably fine. His best target share season was 11%, and he's not going to be a guy that's going to be integrated into an early read progression, right? Very often. But he is a guy that you can get screens and stuff behind the line of scrimmage. I think he's fine to catch check down passes. Never going to be the number 2 in an NFL offense. For that to happen, he would have to land on a team that just doesn't have anything, right? They wouldn't have any wide receivers, any tight ends that they like getting the ball to. So I think that's going to be tough. But if you land on a team that's got one good wide receiver and maybe your wide receiver 2 and your tight end aren't very good, I can see Caleb getting 10, 12% target share in that sort of scenario. So I don't see it being a thing where we're saying that he absolutely can't do it. It just wasn't an area where he was absolutely that he thrived. If you look at him for the course of his career on a targets per route run basis, Ian, 13%, which is really low. So I don't think he's going to be a priority in a passing game, but I do think in the right situation, he could be a guy that could catch the checkdowns.
Certainly wasn't exactly operating in the world's, best passing offense over there with Iowa as well. So got to keep that in mind, which we will. But speaking of passing games, let's get into some of the wide receivers who, again, are a bit overvalued or undervalued based on their draft capital and talent profile right after a quick word from our friends over at Bud Light.
Hey, you're not actually allowed to drink in a beer commercial?
Since when?
You got to wait till it's done. Oh.
5,
4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back, everyone. Dwayne, you mentioned in your rookie running back supermodel, when we actually look at it versus draft capital, it's just as good in terms of projecting future fantasy performance. When you add in the draft capital, it is better. Similar notion with the wide receiver supermodel. It is actually more predictive than just raw draft capital when we are including the draft capital side of things. However, not quite as good as your running back side of things.
Yeah, so a little less confidence in these. So I really did try to narrow down some examples for you guys as we talk through these players, but I would say not as strong as what we've seen historically with the running back model or the tight end model, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. So if you look at it overall, just an NFL draft pick, 0.61 is correlation to future success for wide receivers. And it's a great time to mention wide receiver, right, is actually where NFL draft capital is the lowest. It's also where the supermodel is the lowest. The supermodel overall is stronger for running backs and tight ends. But the part of this is it's also been the same situation for the NFL when they're trying to evaluate these players. It's just tougher to evaluate wide receivers than the other positions. Plus, think about with running back, Ian, it's okay, great, we drafted you, we invested in you, we're just going to hand you the ball. And we're going to let 10 other dudes block. We're going to see what happens. If you're a receiver, great. We're going to put you on the field because you're our first round or our second round pick. But then oh, great. Can you beat press man coverage? Can you get off the line of scrimmage? Then do you actually have the route tree to be able to run all the different route concepts that we want to pair you up with other players on? Then are you reading zone coverage the same way your quarterback is, knowing when to set down, when to keep? There's so many more variables when you think about what a wide receiver's got to deal with. Plus, you got all these other teammates. If you land somewhere with Justin Jefferson, well, guess what? He's good at all those things we just said. So even if you're good, you're just really going to have to earn the trust. We saw that take 2 years for Jordan Addison. He finally started getting some of that love. Last year he got on a heater, but there's just so many other variables. So I think those are the other factors that also come into playing a role here whenever we see that the scores across the board, whether we're just talking about draft capital or the supermodel without draft capital, not quite as strong as what we see with running back or even tight end.
And with that, let's get into these wide receivers, which will not be including Travis Hunter because we're still trying to figure out exactly what side of the ball he is going to primarily be playing on. And honestly, his production profile really wouldn't have him in this conversation anyway. However, that cannot apply to Tetairoa McMillan, Dwayne, who actually has the lower talent score relative to draft capital, just the 27th best all-time score in your model. Again, when not looking at draft capital, up to 12th with, though. So it really does seem like, we could see him as a top 12 pick. That is where Thor had got him going. Small trade up to the Cowboys at pick 10. That would be a fun time. Maybe goes to the Panthers inside the top 10, or maybe he actually falls down into the later parts of round 1. We've even started to hear murmurs that Matthew Golden, even Emeka Ibuka, could be taken ahead of McMillan. Again, not that he's a bad prospect, Dwayne, but when we're looking at him relative to that top 10 potential standing, that's where the supermodel is in a bit of a disagreement.
Right. And when I first wrote the supermodel, he was minus 36 in this category, or minus 32 in this category, but he's fallen 3 spots in his expected draft capital based on mock drafts. He was picked 9 when I wrote it. He's now picked 12, and people are like, oh, wow, that's a huge difference. Yes, because remember, draft capital is not linear, right? It is a logarithmic curve, meaning that the drop off is massive over those early picks, and then it starts to flatten out around the end of round 2, and then it's just a much more steady downgrade from there through the rest of the draft. But in that first round, it's a big deal. So just those 3 picks alone really changed the calculus here. So Tet was being seen as like pretty drastically overvalued by the non-draft capital model. Now it's a minus 16. So it's essentially been cut in half. But if you look at guys that were in a similar range, for the supermodel, we have Drake London, Jahan Dotson, Kadarius Toney. Now I will say Jahan Dotson, Kadarius Toney, they were much more so than Tet McMillan. Tet McMillan sitting at a minus 16, Jahan Dotson minus 47, Kadarius Toney minus 43. So the non-draft capital supermodel, just think of it with it not being quite as strong as what we have for running back and tight end. Like, you really want to see the bigger numbers to make a stand on something. So what I'm telling you is it thinks that Tet's slightly overrated, but it's not saying that he's going to be this bad player. If you look at the guys that really ended up busting, it were those guys that had those huge deltas like Jahan Dotson at minus 47 and Kadarius Toney at minus 43.
Feeling a little bit attacked, Dwayne, as someone who certainly held my fair share of Toney and Dotson bags over the years. Still young players. I know, man.
Yeah.
By still young players, I mean they have absolutely been bust, but, a man can keep on dreaming. But at least in McMillan's case, man, we are talking about some bonkers production here. Led the FBS in receiving yards during these last 2 seasons. And even if the Mike Evans and even Drake London comps are a bit lazy just because we're comping them to pretty much the only other 6'4", 6'5" good wide receivers we can remember, I do trust someone like Dane Brugler shouting out, a T. Higgins sort of mold. And just again, when you get into McMillan's profile a bit more, you don't see, these kind of tall, gangly, Gumby sort of wide receivers be, again, limited athletes and not break as many tackles as McMillan was able to do. So that was the surprising part, man, because again, you just hear him kind of, again, some of these comps, you think of this, guy that can't separate, this jump ball receiver. McMillan does seem to actually have, again, a bit more juice after the catch than perhaps he is given credit for. So is there a landing spot, though, Dwayne, that you would just love to see for McMillan? Because it reminds me a little bit, I mean, it's not that uncommon, I guess, because we guess what, spoiler, everyone, the teams picking in the top half of the draft usually don't have good quarterbacks. So on the one hand, yes, we want higher draft capital, but on the other hand, God forbid McMillan makes it the Chargers or even the Chiefs at the end of round 1. Right. We can still be feeling pretty good about ourselves here.
Yeah, if he slides, it actually helps him. But like the Cowboys could be a smooth landing spot. You obviously have CeeDee Lamb there, but there's nobody locking down the wide receiver 2 role. And if you look at Tet McMillan, like he is a guy that I think pairs well with someone like Dak, Geno, even if the Raiders decided to go wide receiver instead of going with a running back like Ashton Genty. So if you had somebody maybe reaching a little bit for Tet McMillan, like I would take one of those teams. If you look at him, to your point, Ian, like what he did after the catch was actually really good. If you look at his career average depth of target, it was a 14. So some people look at it and are like, well, his yards after the catch was a 5.5. That's not necessarily elite. That's really good for someone with an average depth of target of a 14. So the big thing that's really holding him down, like his production rating is really strong. He attacked all areas of the field. He beat man, he beat zone. He came out with an 88 rating in the supermodel, but his film rating comes out as an 82. And historically, the guys that have really gone on to blow up right after being top 12 picks also had really, really strong film ratings. This is still good. It's an 82. Remember, everything's on a scale of 50 to 100 in the supermodel. So it's good, but it doesn't compare with the very top guys. So some guys that, and that's what's pulling him down here. So if you look at some guys that have scored similarly in that film rating, Drake London was at an 82. Now, London's been fine. First 2 years, maybe not so much because Arthur Smith, bad quarterback issues. But last year we saw with some better quarterback play what Drake London can do. Another one is Garrett Wilson, a guy that you and I contend has a lot of talent. We really do love him, but it just hasn't, for whatever reason, unfolded for him yet. And then the other one is Chris Olave, a guy that showed really strong things as a rookie and in his sophomore year in the NFL, but has battled concussions. So I think the jury still really is out, on Chris Olave. So it's not like it's like this like death row of comps here. But these are guys that weren't quite in the same range as guys like Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, who had like that elite film grade to go along with that production rating. And so that's the difference between what we have with Tet and some of those other guys.
You have a wide receiver going as a projected top 10 pick. You're kind of expecting a perfect profile. So again, not putting down McMillan as a whole, just relative to some of these absolute bona fide studs, leaving a little bit lacking, at least in the eyes of the supermodel. Similar sentiment could be said, Dwain, for Mr. Matthew Golden, 4.29 himself coming out of the combine, and of course the Texas Longhorns. So he actually has just a 45th best all-time score without draft capital. However, under the assumption that he is going to wind up being a top 20 pick, he does raise up to 22nd. That was the sentiment for Thor. He has him going 18th to the Seahawks. So, Dwain, it's not like Golden was a complete unknown before he ran a blazing fast 40, but certainly it seems to help matters. And have you actually heard about, the conspiracy around this at this point?
Yeah, around the 40-yard dash, and how he got the early start on it. He looked so surprised, then he didn't run again. So, yeah, I've heard it. And if it's true, like it's impacting things because that's what's moved him up the board. Let's be honest. Yeah. It's the fact that NFL teams, they love speed. And so if you look, this is a guy that back in December, Ian, was a 3rd or 4th round pick in mock drafts. Now, the more people are doing mock drafts, the stronger that data gets. So also you've kind of got a limited sample with some of those things. But once he went on his run, Texas ends up going in the national championship game. People get all this additional exposure to him, comes out and runs this fantastic 40 time. I mean, this is one of the biggest climbers at the wide receiver position as far as expected draft capital based on NFL mock draft database. And so that's a big part of it. And so what's happened early on, he actually looked like he was even or maybe even a little bit of a value versus the model, but now his draft capital has moved up so much based on this 40 time that it's actually in disagreement. So the non-draft capital supermodel looks at him as a 23% delta versus the model with draft capital. And if we go back historically and look at guys that we thought were going to go between pick 10 and pick 22 in the NFL draft, here are his closest comps. We already talked about a couple of these before, but Jahan Dotson, Kadarius Toney, and then the other one, Jalen Reagor, who went pick 21. So not a very good list. I have quite big concerns about Golden and the delta here. Again, wide receiver supermodel not as strong, but I'm much more worried about Golden than what we talked about with Tet earlier. Because remember, Tet's, we got a little bit of a difference, but now we're starting to get into that larger range with the 23 spot difference and just such a late riser in the process. And let's be honest, Ian, like he just never really produced at the college level, and I've heard some of the stuff where, they just shouldn't really want to feature me. Typically if you're like good, like they want to feature you. His career target share, 17%. So like whenever you start looking at, just a table with all this data on it, that's just a massive outlier. Like you just don't see guys like that. Now, you do get examples like Jalen Waddle, but he played at an absolutely loaded program. Yes, Matthew Golden, playing at Texas, it impacts him some, right? Obviously, but we're not talking about playing in Alabama for 3 seasons like what we talked about with Jalen Waddle. So there's just a lot of things that start to stick out. We look at it as adjusted career receiving yards per team pass attempt. It's in the 44th percentile. That's one of the 2 metrics that goes into the production rating. Now, he was really good when he had the ball in his hands, 67th percentile. So if you get him the ball, he's shown that he can really do good things. But again, he just hasn't shown in the context of being able to live within an offensive environment and really just carve out a significant role for himself at any single point in his career, unless you just want to say, let's take the last 5 to 6 games for Texas once Isaiah Bond was hurt, where he actually did come on.
You can say that at the end, I hear you, but you also got to give him credit because those last 4 or 6 games did come against some of the steeper, competition. SEC championship, 3 playoff games, averaged over 100 yards during those. Yes, it did, partially coincide with Isaiah Bond being injured, but
so look, I do agree with you, Ian. I get it on the big competition stuff, but working with this data for so long in college and NFL, and we just see these massive swings in 4 to 6 game samples that just end up being variance. Like it's just like, the player was hot and then they were never hot again. So I just think we have to be, I think we need to acknowledge it, to your point. Like he did do it against the best competition, but at the same time, there's just as good of a chance that it just comes down to like, there was really nothing even driving it. It just happened to be the games where he was the best, and he's really more like what we saw for the course of his career in college. And again, the model adjusts, and it gives him credit for who he played with. It also gives him credit for whenever he was able to break out based on his age, class, all those different things are in there, and strength of schedule. So I get where you're coming from. I think we have to acknowledge it, but sometimes I do think we overrate those things. And I think the NFL also gets guilty of that. And it does at times push players maybe even higher than they should be.
You think it could just be something, in the water down there at Texas? Because I remember us having similar conversations about A.D. Mitchell last year. Anyone that has checked out, a handful of Longhorns games has unfortunately had to, be a viewer of the Quinn Ewers experience. Really has been one underthrown deep ball after another. So thoughts on, again, just maybe how we see Golden stacking up relative to the two Texas wide receivers last year and Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell.
Yeah, so Worthy was great in the not great, but really good in the model because he was able to carve out such a large portion of his offense. So he did fine. So he's actually, he's the example that it didn't matter for him with Quinn Ewers. Now for A.D. Mitchell, it did matter, and we actually saw A.D. Mitchell struggle to get on the field a little bit as a rookie. But there's decent competition for him for the Colts. But when he was on the field, like the targets per route run, all those things were really strong. So I think there's potentially something there, and I don't want to disagree that you could run into like a check down Charlie. Right. I mean, I do think you could find, and he did check the ball down a lot to running backs, things like that. But it feels very one-off. Like I haven't found anything at this point in the data that really suggests that sort of thing would happen. Typically, if you've got a quarterback that wants to play like that and you've got weapons around them, then that would be on the offensive coordinator to adjust it and say, okay, we're still going to use these guys and we want to feature them. We're just not going to make everything down the field, right? And so I don't know if that was just a disconnect between Sark and what Ewers wanted to do, and then that ultimately impacts the wide receivers. I think it's a valid question. I just struggle to get fully bought into it.
Enough on Texas. We'll move to a different team, though, in Texas, and that is TCU's wide receiver, Jack Bech. Another example of, again, a player having a bit of a lower talent score than when he is projected to go in the draft. So Thor did not actually have him going inside of his top 2 rounds. And, man, Dwayne, without draft capital, we're talking about just 123rd best all-time scorer. So you look at him, Dane Brugler says his play style is reminiscent of Puka Nacua. He's a 6'1", 214-pound receiver. And when you do dig into his profile a little bit more, hey, maybe he didn't break out early because he was playing with Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors at freaking LSU. And then even the 2023 season comes with the reality that he had that dreaded tightrope ankle procedure that helped, again, sap some of the explosiveness throughout the season. So really, again, more of a one-year wonder. But, it just really is a matter, Dwayne, where when we do see these guys after 4 or 5 years, you can kind of make excuses for a lot of them. And the story is you're not looking at a great group of comps for these late producing, more or less one-year wonders.
Yeah, I mean, and for Bech, he would be breaking the mold, if he ended up being a hit. If you look at the historical players in the model that the model less than the NFL, so the non-draft capital model versus the super model, and they were in this range of where he graded out between 75 and 85, and they were 25 plus spots below, right, what we had in the super model. Tutu Atwell, minus 35. We've got Bech at minus 36. We've got Dwayne Eskridge. We've got Van Jefferson, Malachi Corley. We do have a bright spot here, Ian. Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin was the bright spot of this potential group where it's okay, great. You didn't show a lot in college, but maybe you still do have it, and we just haven't seen it yet, because that's the bet. And I will say this, across the board, there are a lot of film analysts that like this guy, right? I mean, it's not like it's 2 or 3. It's like Daniel Jeremiah really likes him. If you listen to, Matt Waldman, he has positive things to say about him. Thor likes him. So just listening to a lot of these, and again, I've been spending a lot of my time when I'm doing yard work actually listening to draft analysts talk, because I've been using Lance's airline, right, as the main way. And Lance likes him as well. If you look at Bech, you look at his profile, production rating 68. So that's what the model's saying. This guy never did it, but the film rating's pretty good at an 81. And so what Lance is saying is, I get it, wasn't great in college, but you got all this other context that you just laid out, Ian. And if you look at his traits and what he could grow into, he could actually be a productive receiver in the NFL. So it's really a matter of production versus what the film is saying, almost across the board based on what the industry is saying.
Do you ever get this idea, though, that these draft analysts who work very hard and we appreciate everything, but they like everyone sometimes, Dwain? And if they like Jack Bech so much, why is he being ranked outside, their top 10 wide receivers? I just feel like in today's age, it's so much easier to say, yeah, I like him, he's fine, and moving on, relative to actually being, giving some honest to God criticism about the guy. So just, again, we can say we like him. Okay, that's the easiest way to move on. Like, do you ever get that vibe?
Yeah, you do. But that's why I love, using Lance Zierlein stuff, is because ahead of the draft, he actually grades all these players. So you can't just do a ranking. The grade is actually the most important part, because it's telling us, like, what bucket does this player fall into as far as how Lance views him. And this is a guy that he sees as being an eventual starter in the league. And so then whenever you hear all of those same kind of sentiments, even though some of the other analysts don't necessarily have a grading process, like, it does open my eyes, just because, like, I feel like there must be something there, because the production was so low for this particular player. I do think you get into other flavors of this where it happens more along the lines of what you were talking about. And it's kind of like, well, we kind of like everybody, but they're overall, I think people, to your point, he's not like ranked super high by anyone. Like, it is a decent stand. Like, this is a guy that I would normally think would be ranked as like a wide receiver 25 in a draft class. So for him to even be in that 10 range or higher, and Matt Harmon was another guy that really liked him. So it's very pervasive in the way the film industry views, like, what this particular player can do. And I do think it's a little bit different than some of that fatigue that we sometimes get with, well, they're good. Because I do think that happens as well.
Love Lance and everything he does. And again, the fact that he does have the prospect grade, is a differentiator. But just, again, based on liking him, based on all these good takes, to see his NFL comp is Cedric Tillman, I just think people might get, a different idea in terms of what the upside they're expecting is. And that is the thing. Look, if you make an NFL starting offense, that is amazing. There's only 96 starting NFL wide receivers in the league if we give them the trio of wide receivers. But again, Dwayne, we're trying to make some freaking money playing fantasy football here. I do think that, just being an NFL starter, I don't know. You wouldn't say that you necessarily like the number 3 wide receiver on the Browns, going into this fantasy year. So maybe I'm just being a bit of a hater, but I've just heard, there's 20, 30 running backs that everyone likes this year. Just like everyone, Dwayne, let's just all just love each other. What's wrong with that, right?
Well, and to your point, like, where Bech grades out in the model, 23% of his comps have gone on to be top 36 wide receivers. So basically 1 in 5. Right. Then you had 14% go on to be top 24, 7% go on to be top 12. So very, very slim chance, right? We're talking about a guy that could go on to be a wide receiver 1, but you start listening to some of the comps these people, give them, like Cooper Kupp is a name that gets thrown around. So I am with you, though, Ian. I mean, right. Yeah, I know. Maybe because he's a slot wide receiver that's white. I get it. But if we look at, the hit rates overall, they've not been great for a guy like Bech. And ultimately, we're talking about guys today that, like, the non-draft capital supermodel really sees as, look, the supermodel with draft capital, the number one factor boosting him is draft capital. And then, it's that film rating.
Another guy who a lot of people like out there, Dwayne, is Washington State wide receiver Kyle Williams. And I will give Chris Sims a massive, just hat tip, because he likes him enough to actually rank him as his wide receiver 2 overall, which is, again, astounding and really does kind of back that up. And maybe that will be the case. However, man, you talk about just a riser in the mock draft field. Dwayne, this was someone who you told me before the show was going as undrafted here a few short months ago. But as people like Chris Sims have gotten their opinion out, and as I guess the mock draft faithful have begun to grind the film a bit more. Big time riser, but maybe if they just look at the supermodel from the first place, they could have seen this profile, was worth chasing.
Yeah, this is kind of cool, because the supermodel, whenever he was looked at as an undrafted free agent, was 42 spots ahead of what was being said about him from a draft capital perspective, and with the supermodel, right, the non-draft capital version. So this is a guy that you mentioned it. Chris Sims is a big part of it, but he's really shot up boards. He's now seen as pick 91 as far as mock drafts go, versus before not taking it all in 7 rounds. So when you look at him before, it was a plus 42 grade, like I said, was the difference. Now it's only plus 3. because the draft capital's actually caught up with where Kyle Williams should be. So now it's essentially neutral. This is the biggest climber of guys not going in the biggest climber is ultimately, Matthew Golden, because again, draft capital is worth so much more in that first round. And he's climbed into that, probably top 20 picks or so. But if we look outside of the first round and we look at guys that have tried to climb into say round 3, that kind of range, Kyle Williams is the biggest climber. One other guy we didn't have on the show sheet that we deleted was the opposite. And it was Alec Manor. He had actually been seen as a massively overrated draft pick, but now the NFL has come down on him. And so we removed him from the show sheet because he was actually in that same range as Jack Bech, but because now the draft cap, the expected draft capital based on mock drafts has come down, it's not a guy that we're talking about. So two guys where it's actually the supermodel was ahead of at least where expected draft cap. We'll see where these guys really get drafted, but it's ahead of what expected they were. It was ahead of expected draft capital based on mocks.
In Williams' case, just a hair under 1,200 receiving yards last year and 14 touchdowns, just one less, through the air from guys like Travis Hunter and Jeremiah Smith. So again, can't say enough good things about that last year production. Really fun to watch in terms of what he's able to do downfield. I mean, Cam Ward and him guys were making plays at Washington State 2 short years ago. So maybe a little bit, too dreamy of a scenario, Dwain, to think the Titans are going to use that 33rd overall pick to get Williams. But again, when we are just looking for guys who maybe can make the most out of a few opportunities, if Kyle Williams can get that round 2 draft capital, man, look out.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one you're hearing about, is pairing him with Cam Ward, the old college teammate. But whenever you look at him, production rating of an 80, Ian, so for guys that are going in the 3rd round of the draft, that's really good. If you look at his film rating, 77, also pretty strong for guys going in round 3 of the draft. So yes, if you look at his target earning ability, 24% target share. So once you get out of those first 2 rounds of wide receivers, this is really one of the better target earners that is left on the board. Also, whenever you look at his, we already talked about his production rating being at an 80, but his adjusted career RIPTA sitting there at the 60th percentile. So yeah, a guy that can do a lot of things. I know there are some folks that think that he's probably limited to being a slot wide receiver. Don't know for sure how that's ultimately going to work out. If you look at his career average depth of target though, Ian, I mean, sitting at an 11, that's decent. It's not like he was completely chained to the line of scrimmage here. And then if you look at what he was able to do after the catch, also pretty strong. So yeah, Kyle Williams, one of these guys, biggest climbers for the second half of the, when I say second half, day 2, biggest probably climber into day 2 of the NFL draft.
Let's move on, talk about a couple tight ends as we close out the Fantasy Live show. And would you say, Dwain, your tight end, supermodel, just overall, just correlation to, again, their success as fantasy performers at the next level, bit closer to RB in a good way than wide receiver?
Yeah, I mean, slightly ahead of running back if you want to be super technical. I would call them even. The supermodel with draft capital is 0.76 for tight ends. For running backs is 0.75. But if you look at the supermodel without draft capital for tight end, 0.71, it's 0.70 for running back. So yeah, we'll call that even. But the model has done really well from a perspective of being, showing a strong signal even when we don't have draft capital in it, which makes this a worthwhile exercise to talk about the next 2 guys we have.
And accordingly, we are talking about, in a lot of people's eyes, the tight end 1 of the 2025 NFL draft, and that is Penn State product Tyler Warren, someone who Thor had going as the 5th overall player in his mock draft, courtesy of a trade up from the San Francisco 49ers. My man Thor is getting crazy, maybe throwing a little bit of shade to one George Kittle out there. But regardless, Dwayne, whether you think he's going 5th or 10th or 15th, really does seem like this guy is going in the top half of the first round, which is really rare to see at tight ends. However, wouldn't have exactly expected that to be the case if you just looked at his, overall talent and production profile.
Yeah, without draft capital in the model, minus 24 spots since 2018 versus draft capital in the model. So supermodel, he's the 5th best prospect we've seen on record. He's the 29th best prospect if you remove draft capital. And the big part of that, Ian, is Tyler Warren was largely just an unknown dude until his 5th year in college. And he suddenly broke out, and he did in a big way. And if you guys have watched this player, he's amazing. He's probably one of my favorite players just to turn the tape on and just watch him. Like this guy, he just looks for contact. He just plays with an absolute edge, a guy you can get the ball to underneath and he can give you all of this yak. But I do start to worry about him with landing spot, right? if you think you're just going to bring Tyler Warren out and just like play him like a traditional tight end and not design things for him, I think it could be a problem. And I think that's what the model is ultimately saying here as well. Because if you go back, whenever they had some other players on the roster and it wasn't all to be centered around Warren, he didn't get all those targets. He didn't have this great receiving yards per team pass attempt, right? If you look at it for the course of his career, it's in the 30th percentile. That by far is that's the lowest mark period we have on record for a guy expected to go in round 1. And he's going ahead of probably where Brock Bowers is going to go in last year's draft. So the model, look, I'm not saying Tyler Warren won't be good, because we'll have the draft capital in there and he's going to project well in the supermodel. But I do think there's some red flags here. And I think landing spot could be a major concern. Like, I think you want him to land somewhere that's willing to say, we're going to design these sort of looks around a tight end, which, Ian, that's not super commonplace in the NFL, because you typically have another good wide receiver on your team. You got maybe a running back that they want to do some of those things with. So I think he really benefited late in his career from that. And it's just something you want to see these players break out earlier in their careers, because that also not just speaks to them just like them being good, period. It also just speaks to like the diversity, right, of all the different things they can do and the way they can earn their targets. And we just didn't really get that from Warren until that final season, when it felt like, like he's just really what they had. Now, to his credit, when they decided to do that with him, he was really good, okay? And the film ratings are absolutely nuts on him. It's a 90 from Lance Zierlein, right? And again, guys, 50 to 100, so a 90 is really good. Like, that's higher than Brock Bowers was at an 89. So Lance really liked what he saw. T.J. Hawkinson was at a 91, to give you another name. So Lance doesn't care about the fact that it didn't happen until that final year. But that's the big thing in the model. It's that production rating, man. It is not strong for compared to other guys that have gone in round 1 of the NFL draft.
You aren't kidding about Penn State really not having anywhere else to go with the football and the passing game. You and I, Dwain, actually had as many catches as the Penn State wide receivers did against Notre Dame as their season ended. So a couple good running backs there. Shout out Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen. Penn State does have some good weapons, bringing all the boys back. I'm sure this will be finally the year James Franklin wins a big game for sure. But yeah, certainly, just sometimes a tough evaluation, because again, it is this thing where he was playing behind Pat Fryermuth. We have Bretton Strange, Zach Kuntz, Theo Johnson. I mean, those are 4 drafted tight ends that, again, we had to see Tyler Warren battle it out with. And you got to give him some credit for that, some leeway. At the same time, Dwain, you couldn't beat out Theo Johnson. You could have beat out Bretton Strange. There's no fault in that, but does that, should that be held against you when you're talking about being a top 10, a top 15 pick? That's more so where we're getting at here.
Yeah. And the beauty is the model is accounting for that. But the model, the way it looks at those things, like you said it perfectly at the end of that statement that you were giving, like obviously, where he's being taken is big. But while Theo Johnson became an NFL draft pick, while Brenton Strange became an NFL draft pick, none of those guys, even Fryermuth, they weren't uber productive in college. And the way the model handles this, it's looking for guys that meet certain RIPTA thresholds, right? Receiving yards per team pass attempt, that are on those teams with you. And that it basically weights those based on those years and looking at some of the playing time and things like that. So it's already accounting for it. But it doesn't give him, he gets a small bump from that in the model, but it's not very big, because none of those guys were like these superstars as collegiate tight ends from a production standpoint.
He gave Tyler Warren a little bit of slack, was a high school quarterback, as many of these top, recruits are, because you just want to get your best player of the ball as much as possible in high school. So maybe the transition took him a little bit longer, but we can also say that for our final tight end, we're talking about Bowling Green's own Harold Fannin Jr., someone who actually was a high school safety, but shout out to Bowling Green. They saw something different, accordingly got the first consensus All-American in Bowling Green history at the end of the day. So yes, it was the, 2024 breakout everyone wants to talk about, and for good reason. 1,555 receiving yards. I mean, you do not see tight ends lead Division I college football in receiving, but lo and behold, Harold Fannin did. But Dwain, even in 2023, man, we're talking about 623 yards and 6 touchdowns for a tight end. That's impressive, especially for one that has only been playing the position for 3 years at this point. So while Thor did have him going outside the top 2 rounds, it does seem like that day 2 draft capital is still on the table here. And man, talking about landing spot being big for Tyler Warren, if we can just get the right team for Harold Fannin, maybe we're looking at the next big producer in fantasy land.
Yeah, and Fannon's one of these guys that's definitely fallen since he ran at the combine, right? Because speed score does matter. It's a major factor in the model. But I do think that the markets have overreacted. When I say the markets, we're talking about mock drafts. I think it's gone too far at this point. And so the model does really see him as being a value, Ian. He is the 4th best prospect in the non-draft capital model versus 11th with draft capital. You talked about the production rating. Like, this guy just really broke a lot of records in the supermodel. He's got a 100 production rating, so he's the best ever. He had a 1.92 adjusted career receiving yards per team pass attempt. And then he was also great when he had the ball, when he got his opportunities, had a 125 career quarterback rating when targeted. That's in the 79th percentile. So, yeah, there's all these issues of people being worried about, is he big enough? He's 141 pounds. Well, guys, the average round 1 NFL tight end, 148 pounds, since 2018. It's not that big of a difference. Oh, he doesn't line up in line enough. Only 43%, right, of his snaps came in line. Oh man, that's just this major issue. No, it's not. If you go back and you look at these tight ends that have gone in round 1, Ian, where do you think Brock Bowers was on that number? Inline snaps for Brock Bowers, 43% for Fannon.
Man, yeah, probably about the same, maybe even lower.
36% for Brock Bowers. Yeah. No one was talking about this with Brock Bowers, right? 40%, 42% for Tyler Warren, a guy that's in the same class that we're talking about, that's essentially in the same range. Yet people want to say this guy can only block cornerbacks. Like, it's just not true. Now, they were not asking him to crash down, on all these defensive ends and stuff, but they're also not asking that of a lot of these other guys. So I feel like we talk about it for one of the players and then not for the other. And then that's the main issue that I have. I feel like he's getting overly punished for these things that, for whatever reason, in public perception, he's way worse than these other players. And let's be honest, when we're looking at tight ends that go in the first 2 rounds, we don't care about them as blockers. We just want them to be really good receivers. And that's ultimately the way the NFL sees it as well. Go back, guys, and look at tight ends taken in the first 2 rounds of NFL drafts. They're not blocking tight ends. Go back to 2018 and just look at them. That's not what the NFL is looking for. They're looking for playmakers. Now, you start to get into round 3, that's where those things trickle in. And so that's where the draft capital, we won't dismiss it. The supermodel will have him as the 11th best guy, assuming he goes somewhere close to the range we have right now, which is pick 77, based on the mock draft data that we have. So we'll see where it ultimately ends, Ian. But this is the guy I really want to be targeting in fantasy drafts, because I feel like if he does hit, it could be a home run. If you miss, great. It's still a whiff, but we're talking about tight ends. We just want to go. We want to go for the upside, period, with all positions, but especially at the tight end position. We know we're going to have a lot of guys that just aren't going to pan out to be much, but I can just see a path where Harold Fannin Jr. get him in the right landing spot, to your point. And I think even at the early 3rd round, we talked about Jacksonville, last week on the show. Man, I would love that if they just decide, we're just going to play you in the Chris Godwin role. Right. I think that would be massive. So that's the thing to watch for with Fannin Jr. Don't just think of who his tight end competition is on the spot that he lands. Also think, who's the slot wide receiver that we've got to deal with here for a guy like Fannin, because he truly was special as a producer in college. And I think, with a lot of tight ends, it would be tricky saying, oh, he's going to take over slot wide receiver duties. If there is a guy that can do it, I think that it would be Fannin Jr.
And it's a great shot on all the blocking stuff, because I think when we have stuff like tight end blocking, running back pass protection, just the idea that some players are injury prone, when we don't have a pretty clear cut way of measuring it or quantifying it, it just becomes this binary, he either has it or he doesn't situation. You know what I'm saying, Dwain? So someone like Fannin, yeah, I agree. Not as good of a blocker as Tyler Warren or Colson Loveland. Okay. Does that mean it's a 0 out of 10 and those guys are a 10 out of 10? No. All right. So let's not completely hold it against the guy. And accordingly, the supermodel is not. So do invite you guys, as always, to go and check out Dwain's Supermodels over at fantasylife.com. Really great resource to, again, help you get ready for draft day coming along soon. So make sure you watch that movie and check out the rest of our Fantasy Life content. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. As always, for Dwain, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I am Ian. Thanks again for checking out the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.